Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me now? Lovely to see you. You guessed that I'm technologically totally out of my depth, and I suspect this afternoon so is Sharon. But thank you for joining us, and it's lovely to see you for the second of our explorations in the book of Job. The book of Job has given rise to one or two proverbial sayings. One is the patience of Job, and that's actually a quotation from the King James version of the letter to James. James is the only reference to Job in the whole of the New Testament. Interestingly enough, Job isn't mentioned in Hebrews 11, which is the great portrait gallery of faith. That may be because Job was a Gentile rather than a member of God's covenant people. But the interesting reference in James chapter 5 says this: "You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy." James chapter 5, verse 11. And as I say, the old King James version spoke of the patience of Job. Perseverance is perhaps a better word, because patience suggests acquiescence, that Job just sat there on the ash heap taking all that happened to him very passively. The Greek word hupomone actually is a stronger word than just passive patience. It means endurance, it means grit, it means the ability to be steadfast. So if you're following in the New International Version as I am, the perseverance of Job is a more accurate translation. The other proverbial saying is the idea of being a Job's comforter. Now, if you say to someone, "You're a right Job's comforter," it has the pejorative air about it, that you're a person who perhaps means well and you're saying some of the right things, but you're actually not very sensitive to the situation. And what I want to do this afternoon is to look at the comforters, the friends that turned up to try and help Job. In some commentaries, they've had a rather bad press, and I want to say one or two positive things about them as well. But let's read from Job chapter 3. It's one of Job's speeches, and arguably it's the darkest speech in the whole book. You remember we said last week that when you get to Job chapter 3, the prose stops and the poetry begins. There's another prose section right at the end, the second part of chapter 42, right at the end of the book. But when we come to chapter 3, we're now entering the poetic stage of the book. And one of the things I think we have to bear in mind is that it's sometimes a mistake to take poetry literally. We know that poetry can express things that perhaps are harder to express in prose. And some of the things Job says in chapter 3 seem to be so dark and so bizarre that I think if we take them all literally, we will wonder that Job managed to speak at all. But I want to read that chapter just to give us a flavour of Job's mood at this point. Some commentators have noticed a difference in Job's attitude when you come to chapter 3. In chapters 1 and 2, Job seems to be quite acquiescent to what God is permitting him to suffer. There's a lovely verse there which says, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." But when you come to Job 3, anger begins to come into the picture. And some commentators have drawn from this the conclusion that the Job of chapters 1 and 2 is quite different from the Job of chapter 3 onwards. Now, I don't really subscribe to that view, because when we're suffering, we actually go through all different moods, don't we? We have experiences that are really dark and difficult to cope with, but there are often brighter periods as well. Going through a period of suffering is not something that perhaps is static. It varies, it ebbs and flows. But Job chapter 3 really speaks of Job in the depths. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, "May the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said a boy is born, that day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. That night may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered in any of the months. May that night be barren. May no shout of joy be heard in it. May those who curse days curse that day. Those who are ready to arouse Leviathan, may its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain and not see the first rays of dawn. For it did not shut the doors of the womb on me to hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not perish at birth or die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who built for themselves places now lying in ruins, with rulers who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden in the ground like a stillborn child, like an infant who never saw the light of day? There the wicked cease from turmoil, and there the weary are at rest. Captives also enjoy their ease. They no longer hear the slave drivers shout. The small and the great are there, and the slave is freed from his master. Why is light given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul, to those who long for death that does not come, who search for it more than for hidden treasure, who are filled with gladness and rejoice when they reach the grave? Why is life given to me, whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For sighing comes to me instead of food. My groans pour out like water. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. Now, if you were feeling low, when you read a chapter like that, you'd feel even worse, wouldn't you? As we said last week, some people have said the book of Job is rather like a Wagner opera. Wonderful moments, like I know that my Redeemer lives, but some awful half hours. And chapter 3 certainly fits into the latter category. But when we dip into chapter 4, we read the speech of the first of the three friends. Then Eliphaz the Temanite replied, "If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It strikes you, and you are dismayed. Should not your piety be your confidence, and your blameless ways your hope? Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? Or as I have observed, those who plough evil and those who sow trouble reap it. The breath of God they are destroyed. The blast of his anger they perish. The lions may roar and growl, yet teeth of the great lions are broken. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered." The word was secretly brought to me. My ears caught a whisper of it. Amid disquieting dreams in the night, when sleep falls on men, fear and trembling seized me and made all my bones shake. A spirit guided past my face, and the hair on my body stood on end. It stopped, but I could not tell what it was. A form stood before my eyes, and I heard a hushed voice. Can a mortal man be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? If God places no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with error, how much more those who live in houses of clay, whose foundations are in the dust, who are crushed more readily than a moth. Between dawn and dusk they are broken to pieces. Unnoticed they perish forever. Are not the cords of their tent pulled up so that they die without wisdom? My word, if you read that chapter out on a Sunday morning, I guarantee you wouldn't be invited back again, at least not for a while. It's pretty grim stuff. One of the things I think we ought to notice from the book of Job is that there is always a mystery to suffering that we cannot fathom. It seems a truism, but it's something we need to stress time and time again, that Job didn't read the first 2 chapters of his book. He hadn't a clue as to what was happening behind the scenes. All he saw was what was happening on the center of the stage. Next time, if we're still able to muster our energy and come together again, we're going to look at that opening part in a little more detail. What does the book of Job teach us about this character called the Satan? But for the moment, we're going to leave that to one side and concentrate on the 3 friends. Now, the 3 friends take up an awful lot of this book. The section that begins at verse 1 of chapter 4 goes right the way through to the end of chapter 27. It is, in fact, the bulk of the book. And the 3 friends are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite. I remember my Bible class leader saying rather cornily, Bildad the Shuhite was the shortest man in the Bible. Think about it, Shuhite. Well, we laughed because we hadn't heard the joke before, but it's quite a well-known one, and as they sometimes say, the old ones are the best. And then we come to the 3rd friend, and he's a man called Zophar the Naamathite. As some commentators say, these 3 friends basically are saying the same thing in different ways. The thing that really upset Job, they would argue, is that these friends were repeating themselves ad nauseum. Their argument, when you boil it down, seems to be this: Job, you must have done something wrong, because if you hadn't sinned, God wouldn't be permitting you to suffer. And in one way or another, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar press that point home. And to be honest, they press it home with increasing ferocity. As you read through the chapters, there's a kind of intensity about their arguments. But basically, they come back to this point time and time again: God is punishing you. Because if you'd truly been a righteous man, Job, you wouldn't be suffering. God would be blessing you. Now, as we saw last week, one of the purposes of the book of Job is to balance up the view that if you walk righteously, God will automatically bless you. We see a modern manifestation of that in the thing that sometimes has been called the health and wealth theology. That if you are obedient to God, then God will see that you're all right. Life will turn out smoothly for you. It will be a bed of roses. And if something goes wrong, it's a sure indication that somewhere along the line you've committed some sin. Now, the first 2 chapters make the point very strongly that that was not the case with Job. And one of the big mistakes these 3 friends make, and make repeatedly, is that they believe there is an absolute link between sin and suffering. It reminds me of the 9th chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus encounters a man who has been born blind. And do you remember what the people say to Jesus? Rabbi, who sinned, this man or possibly even his parents? Now, if we're adherents of some Eastern religions, we've heard of the doctrine of karma. And that means whatever you do, you will reap the results of it, positively or negatively. And if you believe in reincarnation, then it's possible you won't reap the results of your sin until you get into the next life. But sooner or later, karma will catch up with you. It's important to realize that the scales of justice automatically will click in and you will suffer for the sins you've committed. Now, if the book of Job is saying anything to us at all, it's saying life isn't like that always. And we must try and detach ourselves from that simplistic view that sin and suffering always go hand in hand, that one is the result of the other. If you look at these speeches in detail, and it is worth doing so, but I would advise you not to do it in one sitting, otherwise you will be really cast down in the dumps, particularly if it's a wet, windy Wednesday and you want to cuddle up with a good book. Don't make the book of Job that book. But if you read them in detail, you will see that they come at it from slightly different angles. Chapter 4 speaks of a kind of mystical experience that Eliphaz had. It begins at verse 12. A word was secretly brought to me. My ears caught a whisper of it. Amidst quieting dreams in the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear and trembling seized me and made all my bones shake. Eliphaz had had some sort of nightmare. And in that nightmare, he claims God spoke to him and gave him a word, basically, that if someone was suffering, they automatically were guilty of some sin. Now, I don't know whether you dream very much or not. A lot of people said they dreamt more during the periods of lockdown. I have some weird dreams. I'm not going to betray all my secrets in public, but last night I dreamt of 3 of my old grammar school teachers, and I can't for the life of me think why. One was a teacher in modern languages, and he never taught me in the years I was at Spalding Grammar. He didn't ever teach me. Another was my Latin teacher. Well, that was the bit of the dream that fitted into the category of a nightmare. The other one was a chemistry teacher who, again, had never taught me. And why in my dream I should think of these 3 teachers from 60 odd years ago, I haven't a clue. Some people think that if you dream, automatically God must be speaking to you. And in a way, Eliphaz endorses that view. He says, I had some sort of mystical experience in the middle of the night. This is what God said to me. And Job, I want to tell you about it. When you come to the next friend, Bildad the Shuhite, he's a bit of a traditionalist. We might call Eliphaz the mystic. He's the one who's a bit airy-fairy, but Bildad the Shuhite is much more of a traditionalist. And in his speeches, he quotes people that he's come across in earlier days, and he says, this is what people have always said on this subject. And if people have always said it on this subject, then it must be right. When you come to the third friend, Zophar, well, he's a bit of a dogmatist. There's even less of a spirit of tolerance in Zophar than there is in Eliphaz or Bildad, and that's saying something. And he really does batter Job. He pulverizes him into trying to admit what this secret sin is. And Job becomes even more distraught and says, look, if I knew what it was, I'd tell you. But the fact of the matter is, I can't think of anything that's causing this dreadful suffering to come upon me. Now, what do all those three friends have in common? Well, the first thing is that they are not people who can listen very well. Now, it's true that when they first come to Job, they sit in silence for 7 days. And many commentators have said that's the best thing they ever did. The pity is they broke the silence. But if you look at the chapter, it's not they who broke the silence, it's Job who broke the silence, the beginning of chapter 3. But we pointed out to each other last week that their silence may not have been as pious and as sensitive as it seemed, because to sit in silence was a sign of mourning. It was a sign that someone had died. They shaved their head and they went and sat with Job on the ash heap, the village rubbish dump. And there they kept silence for 7 days. And the kind of subliminal message of that would be, Job, we're regarding you as already dead and gone. There's not much point in speaking to you because you've had it. You've passed the point of no return. So that 7 days of silence is not perhaps the sensitive thing that we might understand it as being. But what these three friends seem to be with Job is always at loggerheads with him. They're always at cross purposes. They've got their own speeches worked out, and they say what they're going to say, irrespective of what Job says. They don't engage with him. And I would say that if we're ever in a position, as most of us are, to sit alongside those who are going through great times of suffering and distress, we should avoid their mistake of feeling we've got to say something. I think I told you last week of the occasion that I met very early on in my ministry when a little 5-year-old girl had been crushed to death by a lorry outside a house. And I went to the house and I plucked up courage after going past it 4 or 5 times to actually knock on the door. And several years later, they said to me, the thing was not what you said, Neil, but the fact that you came. And presence is a great source of therapy. These friends, by rabbiting on at Job, I think just simply made matters worse. Now, if you've really read the book of Job, you'll know that there's a 4th friend that comes along. And he's a fascinating character. He doesn't appear till chapter 32, but then he holds center stage till chapter 37. So if you work it out, this man called Elihu, and I love the way in which he's introduced, Elihu the Buzite. What a full ascription that is. Job comes from the land of Oz, and Elihu comes from the land of Boz. You know, someone ought to make a chorus out of all of this. One from the land of Oz and one from the land of Boz. They were, of course, descendants of Abraham, and they're mentioned in the book of Genesis. But they lived over to the east. They lived possibly in that area that we call the land of Eden. They were not part of God's covenant people. Elihu comes along, and he holds center stage, and his speech is actually one of the longest in the whole book. He gets chapter after chapter to himself. Now, I was discussing my studies a little while ago with a friend, and I said, what do you make of Elihu? And his name was Philip. And he said, oh, he's just a later addition to the book. Someone slipped in the chapters about Elihu, and they make no real sense. They're totally out of context. I'm not so sure about that. There's no textual evidence that they're an interpolation. And in some respects, Elihu takes the argument on a bit. Now, the problem with Elihu is that much of what he says is true, but it's always the way in which he says it that causes me to worry a little bit. Now, have you met those Christian people who mean well, and they come armed with a couple of Bible verses, and maybe even they've got a little booklet that they want to give you, and they press that upon you, and somehow you believe they've got a hidden agenda and they're going to follow that agenda through, whatever you feel. I mustn't go into too much detail here, but once or twice when I've been ill over the years, and thank God I haven't suffered from too much illness, but I've actually seen people coming to the man's door, and I've hidden behind the door and tried to pretend I wasn't at home. Because now that's an awful thing for a Baptist minister to admit, isn't it? And I'm sure Methodist pastors are far more sensitive than that, aren't they, Sharon? Yeah, she's nodding in approval. But you see, some people, you know exactly what they're going to say. And what they're going to say isn't necessarily heretical, but it's the way they say it. And I can remember years ago, a dear lady who was dying of breast cancer in Priscilla Bacon Lodge. She was a lady called Rhoda, and she'd been my organist at Dereham Road for a number of years. And if ever there was a godly woman, it was Rhoda. And when I went to visit her once toward the end of her life in Priscilla Bacon Lodge, she said, "Please don't let people pester me with the view that God wants to heal me." She said, and this had the ring of truth about it. She said, "I'm totally at peace with God. I know that I haven't got long for this world, but I know where I'm going. And in some respects, while I'll be sad to leave my loved ones, I can't wait to see my Saviour." And she was saying to me, please be careful about what you pray for. When my own wife was dying of leukemia, someone who didn't belong to my church in Folsham, but who I think meant well, said to me, "Neil, if you really wanted her to be healed, you'd take her to this or that meeting." And at that time, we were perfectly at peace with what was happening. And to have gone scampering around from meeting to meeting to meeting, trying somehow to clutch hold of God's the hem of his garment, would I think have disturbed our peace. Now, what I am not saying is that God doesn't heal today, because in my experience, God does heal, and sometimes heal without any medical explanation whatsoever. But I'd have to be honest and say the cases where that has happened, in my experience, have been few and far between. And perhaps what is a greater peace is that peace which passes understanding, whereby we feel secure in the presence of God. I can't help but feel that these three friends, or if you count Elihu in, 4 friends, made Job feel worse. They came along and they battered him with argument after argument after argument, and they didn't really listen to him. And you see, not only did they refuse to listen to him and take him seriously, they didn't know the whole story. And one of the things that I want to explore as we come toward the end of our studies in a couple of weeks' time is that the book of Job doesn't solve the mystery of suffering. Some people have rather superficially said the book of Job is the Bible's answer as to why we suffer. And I would say not so. It's not as simple as that, and I'm not sure the book is in the Bible for that reason. You may like to discuss that. But what I think we need to do is to recognize that when all is said and done, and an awful lot in the book of Job was said, the mystery still remains. Interestingly enough, God himself doesn't speak to Job until much later on in the book. When he does, Job gets an answer, but it's not the answer that he expects. Now, Sharon, will you work your magic, please? And we'll plug in and